Welcome to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, a podcast about geek culture by lawyers, with your hosts, Ben Siders and Kirk Damon. Today's episode is brought to you by the Department of the Interior Bureau of Displaced Antiquities. Wait, no it isn't, because we don't have any displaced antiquities. None at all.
And welcome back to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy with your host, Ben Siders. That's me, and the other guy is Kirk Damon.
Kirk isn't the captain of the Enterprise.
Today's topic is trademarks. We actually have not talked that much about trademarks, Kirk.
We haven't, mostly because of the fact that we've been talking about the 80s, according to some of our mailbags from the last episode. But yeah, we've been focusing obviously on patent law, and actually surprisingly contract law quite a bit as well.
I actually just had a trivia night about the 80s, and I realized at that event how much I have forgotten about the 80s. Much more than I remember.
Well, what I think is most stunning is when I actually watch movies that sort of flash back to the 80s. So like one of the ones, and my wife loves the movie, is 13 Going on 30, which quite frankly, even though it's a romantic comedy, if you are a child of the 80s, you will get a kick out of just because it makes fun of a lot of things from the 80s, kind of has fun with them and stuff like that. Because you have somebody that's a child of the 80s suddenly getting thrown into, 17 years later, as I said, 13 going on 30, and trying to bring the 80s into the late 90s, early 2000s, and it just doesn't work. But yeah, there's things in it where they're doing these things, and I'm like, I don't think I ever encountered that in the 80s. Like, this is what, Have
they started making 90s nostalgia films yet?
No, I don't think they have, though. We were joking about it. My wife and I happened to be when we were traveling a few weeks ago, and we happened to comment about it. We ended up, we were listening to the radio, and we flipped over, and we had both our kids in the car, and it's Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody started. And we're like, okay, you kids need to hear this just because it's a piece of music you need to hear. And we realized it was on the Oldies show.
Oh, my. Yeah, I tuned Pandora to my 90s alternative rock station, and then me and my kids go downstairs and work on a puzzle that we're doing. And invariably some song comes on that they're like, what is this? This is garbage. Why can't we listen to something good? And I can't even begin to tell you what they consider to be good. But suffice it to say, children have terrible taste in music.
we had fun with it, actually, in the end, because it's my daughter's currently taking guitar lessons. And one of the things we had is, in the course of it, one of the songs that came on soon after Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody was Freebird. Mm-hmm. And so we set our daughter up, but when her guitar teacher asked, what's the next song you want to play, she apparently told him Freebird.
Yeah, this lesson's only 30 minutes, kid. All right, so we're going to talk today about that time that LucasArts appeared to claim a trademark to the word Nazi. This topic comes to us from Ed in Grand Rapids, so thank you, Ed. And in fact, we were just talking about going up there this summer maybe for another beer festival, maybe Kalamazoo. I think the Michigan Brewers Guild one is in Ypsilanti now. That's
the summer one, yeah.
Yeah, that's a hike. So we might see if Kalamazoo has one that's closer. So Ed, if we do that, we'll look you up.
Yeah, we've traditionally gone up there for the one in Grand Rapids, the winter one. We just didn't dare this year as to what it is. A little concerned about the weather.
We're told the weather is unusually, inclement in Michigan this year.
Unusually inclement. It is inclement. It's Michigan.
Always inclement, yeah. Okay, so the background of this topic, for those of you who don't know, this has long been an urban legend in the gaming community that TSR, that's the company that used to publish Dungeons & Dragons, tried to trademark the word Nazi. And this rumor, I think, has its genesis in obligatory 1990s era TSR hate. The reasons for this hate are pretty complex. The short version is that there was some internal dispute within TSR over who actually owned what aspects of the Dungeons & Dragons property. And TSR in the 90s got pretty big, pretty popular.
Yeah, very big, I think is the answer.
And began to churn out just an inhumane amount of material, a lot of source books and supplementary materials, and licensing what, in my humble opinion, are highly unqualified authors to spit out just dozens and dozens of books. I've read like 35 Dragonlance books. Yeah. About 5 are worth reading.
Oh, and the 5 that are worth reading are like worth reading even if they have nothing to do with Dungeons & Dragons.
No, there's
generally good fantasy novels.
So TSR was at that point, had well established its legal and business and IP defenses. But then the internet came out, and TSR's response to the internet was similar to most of the music industry's response.
And most other big established industries that were worried about losing things.
What is this terrifying thing that threatens to swallow all of our IP, and what do we do about it? I know. Let's threaten to sue everybody. So that annoyed everybody and was viewed as a symbol of TSR's sort of corporate greed and subsuming their dedication to making fun games for we outcast nerds to play.
Yep.
And it also gave rise to the 1990s meme $R instead of TSR to refer to them.
One thing also, just for those of you who may be younger in conjunction with this, I think it's important to point out with TSR. TSR, for the most part, is a company that's still around, but
Wizards
people
of the
haven't
Coast
really
now.
heard of it. It's part of Wizards of the Coast, but most people haven't really heard about it. And at this point in time, if you're a role player, you're a collectible card gamer, anything along those lines, you've got to keep in mind how kind of revolutionary Dungeons & Dragons was at the time that it came out. I mean, it's the concept of role-playing games really didn't exist before Dungeons & Dragons, and not in that respect. And what you saw going into, I believe, the 80s and 90s, and I think it's sort of safe to say it happened in there, and even arguably in some sense the late 70s, was a creation of games that we today think are completely ubiquitous. I mean, we have the creation of the role-playing game, we have the creation of the tabletop war game, essentially created by Games Workshop, and we have the creation of the collectible card game, which was basically created by Wizards of the Coast and Magic the Gathering. When these games came out, I don't think anybody expected them to be the phenomenons they are.
Certainly not Dungeons & Dragons.
Yeah, definitely not Dungeons & Dragons.
Niche.
And Dungeons & Dragons also was something that went outside of geek culture and it grabbed a bit of popularity. I remember that, there was a number of cases about like suicides that were arguably related to Dungeons & Dragons.
Yeah, there was the big occult scare in the early 90s.
And I know there's a book out because I got it from the library and never actually read the full thing, called The Dungeon Master, which is about one of the suicides and sort of the concerns associated with the role-playing games. One of the things that I think is interesting, because that part of that is I think we look at it now and go, all it is storytelling. But at the time, it was so new that nobody really knew how this worked.
Well, and the Dungeons & Dragons cover art had like demons and stuff on it, and had a whole polytheistic religious theme running through it, and a lot of things that did seem like occult themes. That wasn't the point of the book; it was just an aspect of it.
Yeah.
But you've got to, those of you who are younger may not appreciate that. The world was, not that long ago, much more religiously oriented than it is now. It still is.
Puritanically religious. I think is the better way to say it.
There's a lot of confusion and fear about these things. I mean, you see it a little bit now with people complaining about Harry Potter, encouraging Wiccanism and stuff like that. But that's more isolated to specific religious beliefs. It's not widespread throughout just sort of mainstream religions. But in the 70s and 80s, it was weird. It was a little different. I think the boomers were a little more paranoid about this stuff and understood it less because they didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
It's not like now where you just see it on the news or you could just see it on the internet and it was just familiar. It was something new, and all you heard was there are, these outcast kids with long hair and torn up jeans that listen to the rock and roll and heavy metal music and do drugs, and they play these games and they wind up doing weird things.
Yeah, and the other thing to keep in mind is there was also, I think, a substantially more fear of the idea of occult cults.
Yeah.
And I know I've read stuff recently talking about the fact that, there's actually some argument, interestingly enough, that was being used as a way to actually challenge communists. Whether or not that's true depends on whether or not you believe the internet. But one of the things that, I think you really got to sort of keep in mind when this kind of stuff came out was this was radical. And it started off as just guys doing this kind of as a hobby. It then kind of grew beyond a proportion that nobody expected to, and grew in a lot of different ways. It was you had Dungeons & Dragons come in, but then you had all sorts of these other things come in. And I've commented about it before. I used to play a lot of Shadowrun. You want to have a great idea of sort of what the fears of the 80s were, go look at the post-apocalyptic world that is created in Shadowrun. The world is run by the Japanese mafia. Because at that point in time, we were terrified of Japan. That was, part of what it was. They were going to economically destroy us. There was still some threats of nuclear war. So the idea of sort of nuclear war, nuclear devastation is all present in these things. You kind of see the fear of the 80s. I know we both read it. You recommended the book to me of Snow Crash. Mm-hmm. That's another great example. Like you see, if you grew up in the 80s, you see things from the 80s.
All those fears reflected right in there.
Yeah, the fears and also where the world is going. I love the idea that the most important job in the world is pizza delivery man.
That is the most important job in the world.
But it has to be 30 minutes because that was such a big deal at that point in time.
Yeah, late pizza was a matter of a news story in that book. Yeah. Well, I think also the occult thing, the Dungeons and Dragons sort of grew up in the mid to late 70s and was popularized in the 80s. And you got to think parents of children in the early 80s, their formative years, they lived through the Charles Manson, situation. So there was, it's not a completely irrational fear of these things, overblown, but this is the backdrop for it. So TSR was, a company that was popularizing this, and parents didn't like it, and it sort of became underground. I mean, I played Dungeons and Dragons secretly with my friends.
Yep. I think a lot of people played it in secret.
Because I thought my mom wouldn't let me. Yep. She eventually, got over it. But anyway, so at some point in the 90s, TSR got a license from George Lucas, Lucasfilm or LucasArts, I forget which, to make an Indiana Jones tabletop game, and the game had little stand-up paper characters to represent the various
you can use miniatures, I think, but it came with paper cutouts to make it easy.
So Indiana Jones is obviously set during World War II, and the main antagonist is the Nazis. And as part of the license deal, TSR was required to put trademark TMs on all of the character names supplied by Lucas Legal, and that makes sense for some. Indiana Jones trademark, of course,
obviously.
However, for because of reasons, somebody at TSR just slapped the TM on everything up to and including a generic Nazi soldier. Underneath it says Nazi TM. And gamers remembered this, and since it happened in the 90s when anti-TSR sentiment was pretty high, it ex post it morphed into an urban legend that TSR itself had tried to trademark the word Nazi, and anytime you say or type the word Nazi, you owe them a nickel or something stupid like that.
And I think one of the things to keep in mind about why would gamers sort of pounce on this in some respects is because in the 90s, you have this idea that TSR is sold out. That's what you kind of have this feeling coming down through it that, again, we said this came out of the idea you played this game secretly in your basement. It was something for hobbyists. It was sort of for outcast kids.
Oh, yeah, all those outcasts to get together and have something to do.
Yeah, it had now become mainstream. Gaming, role-playing games were becoming mainstream. It was becoming something that normal people played.
There was a sentiment that they had forgotten who their core customers were and were seeking profits at the expense of those people.
Expense of other people. And that, so you look at this and you say, this is just one example of them doing that. Look, they're trademarking the term Nazi.
Which is not what happened, of course. But, the truth is, TSR did publish a game with a little Nazi placard that had the word Nazi with a trademark after it. So,
well, with a TM. That's the important thing to keep in mind.
So, in a sense, there's at least an accidental claim of a common law trademark on the term Nazi. I don't think it would go so far as to say they were actually claiming that they have that trademark, but it appeared there. It gave rise to this urban legend. And so we thought it'd be a fun exercise to kind of play that out. What really was the effect of them doing this? And that requires a little bit of an exploration of trademark law, which we really haven't talked about much since our first episode.
Yeah, and the thing to keep in mind about trademark law is that, and I talk to people, a lot of people think of trademark law as being designed to protect companies or something like that. It's not. Trademark law is actually designed to protect the consumer.
Yeah.
But it's a recognition that effectively the protection of the consumer relies upon the action of the producer.
Yeah, the idea is so you have to go back to where trademarks come from. There was a time when we didn't have machines to make everything, and if you wanted to buy a thing, you had to go find a person who knew how to make that thing. And what would happen is people who were really good at making stuff would literally put a brand or a mark or something on the product, whether it was a gun or a horseshoe or whatever, and that became known as a trademark. It would be a way to identify who made the product. Well, what people who are bad at making stuff figured out pretty quick is they can make crappy things and stick the same mark on it and trick other people into buying it. And so this law of unfair competition developed, and the idea was, it's not fair to the consumer that they're being basically defrauded into buying something.
Yep.
Now, it's a trademark, right? It's not an affirmative misrepresentation, but you know what you're doing if you mislabel something.
Yeah.
So fraud is not really a neat fit as a remedy. And so we developed this law of trademarks saying that once you start to use a mark in commerce and that the mark becomes associated with your goods and services, other people can't use the same or confusingly similar marks to try to trade on your goodwill.
Yep. And the key to it is it's trademark is based upon the use of the mark associated with goods or services in commerce. We've talked about the idea that in trademark law, there is a trademark registry that's maintained by the United States Patent and Trademark Office.
And the states have them too, but nobody
states have them
really
too,
uses them.
and there's some other things out there. Occasionally the states ones matter. But it's really about use and association. So you can technically get a trademark, and I think for good reason, without ever registering it. And that's commonly referred to as a common law trademark.
And that's what the TM means, is a claim of common law trademark rights.
And it's key that the TM does not mean you have a common law trademark. It's you claiming you have a common law trademark.
So the idea is that you don't trick consumers into buying something thinking it's from person A when it's not. And these ideas have expanded over the years from literal marks on products to brands. And so we have false marking rules. I can't mark something and say it's made by Disney if it's not. There's trademark infringement where even if my trademark is different, if the goods and services are similar and the trademark is close enough, then basically, is there a risk you're going to confuse people into buying your thing when they think they're getting somebody else's thing? There's tarnishment. Why don't you talk about that, Kirk?
Yeah, I can talk about tarnishment a little bit. Tarnishment basically is the idea that, by presenting something with a similar trademark, it might not be confusing, but it might damage the brand.
Particularly if the unsavory association.
Yeah, unsavory associations. The easiest one to look at it is, say you have a trademark for anything associated with children and sort of well associated with children's products, and now I want to stick it on pornography.
Yeah.
Unrelated bands, unrelated
unrelated goods. There's going to be no confusion, but it is going to make your trademark look bad.
It's going to make the trademark look bad, and it's something we kind of also look at it and go, look, a company that's basically trying to build a brand around, being kid-friendly should not be forced to accept something that they basically would find offensive to them, even though it's not confusing to the consumer. It's negative to their brand image.
It's important to understand that the trademark does not give you a complete monopoly over all use of language. Apple obviously has a trademark. Apple is applied to computers and various other things. But I can still go to the grocery store and buy a product called an apple.
Yep.
And it's a fruit.
And the idea behind that is because you can't trademark what are called generic names.
Yeah,
so
we'll get
the
into
apple
that.
being a fruit is a generic name for that particular kind of fruit, but it is a trademark when associated with computers and computer products because there's no generic apple fruit, generic Apple computer. And so I think you have those. The thing with the trademark is, again, that association with the particular goods in commerce that are sold.
And a source. Who's it coming from?
Who is it coming from? And what you're really trying to connect, and what trademark law is trying to say, is that somebody buying an Apple computer knows who made it.
Yeah.
And from
based on that,
they can infer what they want to infer about the product. Whether it's, you can be an Apple lover or an Apple hater. That's the point. That
the point is there's information efficiency. Just by saying Apple, you know a lot about it. And the example I often give is when we give talks about IP, I compare, you're driving down the street and you got a bunch of kids in the back of your car and they're starving and they're hungry and they're complaining, and you come up to one of those blue signs that says what amenities there are at the next stop, and there's two signs. One is McDonald's and one is Angry Andy's Furious Burgers. Yeah. Kirk, you and I are going to Angry Andy's.
Yeah, just because of the nature of who we are. Yes, I mean, it's basically being called Angry Andy's.
But when you got kids in the car, you're going to McDonald's, because just by saying McDonald's, I know what they serve, I know how much it costs, I know how quick I can get in and out, I know there's a bathroom, there's probably a playland, I know all kinds of stuff, because McDonald's has spent a fortune to make sure I know all of this about them.
Yeah, and that's exactly the idea behind it. And I think when you get into one of the things I always think is interesting is it's trademark attorneys and marketing people. Marketing people are always very into talking about branding, and what they're actually talking about is trademarking. But they don't, in many respects, understand the law of trademarks and the law of trademarking. But that's what they're doing. They're making it so that when you see a brand, it's a shorthand for what you expect it to be. So again, if you look at an iPhone, you have a shorthand for what that product is supposed to be. You know who made it, what features it has, stuff along those lines. If somebody came out with a different phone, called it that same thing, there would be confusion as to what it is. It isn't to say that's the product you want to purchase, or that you give a good association with that mark. It's simply that you have an association with that mark. And that association is essentially an accurate association for what it is.
And people try to use trademarks commercially to hint at what their goods and services are, so they can convey information effectively. And the great example of that is if you ever go to a Walgreens, okay, you walk in and you want to get some Benadryl. Right next to Benadryl is Wall Drill.
Yeah.
Clearly a different trademark, but it's put right next to it. And the fact that it has DRYL at the end, it doesn't take a lot of mental gymnastics to figure out that it's a generic competing product to Benadryl.
Particularly also having the wall in front of it, you also know it's Walgreens.
You also know it's Walgreens,
version.
Exactly. So you can use the drill part, which ostensibly by itself is not enough to be confusing, and you can put the product side by side, and you can do that to convey information about what it is.
But as I said, the thing about it is it only conveys what it is, but it also did actually tell you who the manufacturer is. It's presumably a generic of Walgreens, as opposed to a generic manufactured by a third party that would also potentially be sitting next to it.
Now, we talked in our very first episode about what form of IP protects universes, and we talked about that in the context of the Rogue One trailer at the time.
Yep.
So Star Wars, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, and part of the problem a limitation of IP law is that copyright is not the best tool for this, because the whole point of copyright is that it covers expressions of ideas, not ideas themselves. So if I wanted to, an example we're going to talk about is what stops me from making a movie or a game set in the Middle-earth setting. And so we're going to make a board game, and we're going to call it Minas Tirith, which is the capital human city in Lord of the Rings.
Yep.
Why can't I do that? Is there a copyright to the name Minas Tirith?
Well, and again, the argument here you bump into is the name Minas Tirith is probably too short to be copyrighted. You can't copyright short phrases, individual names, individual titles, sort of stuff like that. Copyright requires sort of what they call a modicum of creativity to sort of get beyond it. It's probably too short. Now, maybe you could because it's essentially a made-up word. But the thing that I think you're going to bump into is that there's a good argument copyright doesn't apply.
Certainly not patentable.
Yeah, and to the extent that we even say Minas Tirith, we can pick another alternative, which gets to a little more basic of a name.
Osgiliath.
That commonly refers to something. Yeah, Weathertop being a good example. That commonly refer, that's closer to generic wording. So now we're really saying it's probably not copyrightable.
Yeah, so what interest could prevent you from doing this? It's got to be some sort of trademark interest, right? Because the concern or the legal concern is the same as in trademark. We don't want just anybody to be able to make a game called Minas Tirith and sell it. And the reason is because why is somebody going to go play this game? Is it because you have great game mechanics and a great game design, or because they're Lord of the Rings fans and it's called Minas Tirith?
Yeah.
And the idea is, it just seems fundamentally unfair that, Tolkien's estate and the movie studios, it was a New Line, I think, does the Hobbit movie or the Lord of the Rings movies. They've put a lot of time and money into building up goodwill in these brands. And if you come along and sell a Minas Tirith board game and call it that, people are going to buy it based on their familiarity with the brand, regardless of the quality of the product.
The interesting thing about it is, and I think this is the thing, we're talking about the brand. There is no Minas Tirith brand.
That's the thing. To get the trademark rights, what have they sold under the brand name Minas Tirith to establish trademark rights in, say, a board game?
Yeah, and the issue I think you particularly get into is let's go before movies. So let's actually jump before the Lord of the Rings movies existed. They were just books. There were basically no products for Lord of the Rings. There were 3 books, arguably a 4th. But the thing that I think you get into is we're looking at this and saying this seems like trademark law should apply here. This feels like it's trademark related, like you're trading off goodwill of another.
You clearly
like you're causing consumer confusion. That sounds like what you're trying to do. But where's the underlying trademark? Where's the underlying product whose stuff I'm co-opting?
You can't have trademark infringement without owning a trademark.
Yeah.
So that's part of the problem. So then you get into these other theories like dilution and things like that, maybe that could apply, but it's not always a neat fit. And this is where, people who are small-time actors can sometimes get away with this because they're not making very much. People in Etsy stores and whatnot will make and sell branded things, sometimes using officially licensed materials. So then they make a physical product like a pillow or a stuffed a plush toy or something. But what happens, I think, more often, particularly for bigger companies, is they just recreate the same look and feel that they want in their own brand. And I think the best example of that people be familiar with is Warcraft.
Yeah, I think when you start getting into this, you guys start with Warcraft and StarCraft. Let's be truthful too; it's both halves of it. The thing that I think you've really got to keep in mind, and again, what we're talking about with this is we're talking about an area of what does it mean to be saying a word that arguably isn't a trademark, but seems to have trademark-type connotations versus copying essentially wholesale the concept,
the idea,
but getting rid of the words.
Yeah, so the background on Warcraft, for those of you who don't know, Warcraft started in like 94, I want to say, with the original Orcs vs. Humans game. I think I was in college at the time.
Warcraft 1, yeah.
Yeah. And it's since expanded, obviously, to the World of Warcraft, by far the most successful online RPG. What's funny, though, is Blizzard, I believe, originally tried to license the Warhammer universe to make games, but Warhammer at the time was sort of well known as having very tight creative
Games
control.
Workshop. And they weren't really making. I think they were making their own games in conjunction with a few video games, like the Epic game was out and stuff like that. But I think they were a little unsure about this. Quite frankly, I think this is me guessing, but I think they were a little unsure about this whole multiple player RPG universe
Blizzard was a new
concept.
company, I think, at the time. I think they'd done some work with Marvel, maybe, and on some comic games. But Blizzard wanted more creative control over their property, and them and Games Workshop just couldn't work out a way to do this and satisfy the needs of both parties. So they didn't. Instead, Blizzard developed the Warcraft universe, which, if you know both properties, there's a lot of overlap in terms of themes and look and feel, very similar, to the point that when Warhammer released its own
Warhammer Age of Reckoning or War.
Yeah, which I played, and that was very fun. I loved it. I remember getting on there and people being like, "This is just a ripoff of Warcraft." I'm like, "Don't you say that to a Games Workshop fan? You'll get punched."
Because effectively, Warcraft was a ripoff of Warhammer.
Yeah,
Except for the fact that Warhammer was arguably a ripoff of Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, like these mythos all go back to the Tolkien archetypes for elves and dwarves and all this
stuff.
stuff.
And we've mentioned this previously in one of our very early episodes. What you bump into is if you think about who came up with the concept of dwarves are short and use axes, the most implausible thing. Why don't you use a two-handed axe when you're short and have no leverage? That's Tolkien. That's really where sort of that play started. The idea of elves being haughty and aloof started with Tolkien.
And shooting bows. And
yeah, you have a lot of sort of what we consider to be just generic archetypes in the fantasy world, in some sense stretch back to the Lord of the Rings.
Well, you have a situation where, a company wanted to use a setting, couldn't come to business terms, and so they just made up a new setting of their own. And you can do that. Copyright, idea, expression. It's the same ideas expressed differently. That's fine. And we're even seeing this now with, if you've seen Seth MacFarlane, the Family Guy creator. He's got a show called The Orville, which I've seen part of one episode. It looks a lot like Star Trek: The Next Generation. It looks like it feels like it, except it's got your typical Seth MacFarlane toilet humor thrown in here and there. But it's the same basic idea. It's basically like a fan film that's being produced by actual people. But you can do that. So trademark interests are what's going to protect a universe. Copyright's not going to do it. Patent certainly is not. But like we said, there's a problem. Continuing with the Minas Tirith example, you get trademark rights at common law by offering the goods and services, and arguably they haven't.
Yeah, where are the goods and services under this? And particularly you also get into, remember, it's the goods and services have to be somewhat similar as well, too. There's got to be some likelihood of confusion. One of the cases I remember looking into, early into this is the kryptonite bike locks. Kryptonite obviously being Superman's antithesis and the material that could bring him down. What did CC Comics trademark under the name Kryptonite?
Or how about Carbonite, the data protection service?
Yep. You're getting into a lot of these. Now, interesting, in the Kryptonite one, if you actually read through the Kryptonite case, they're discussing trademark infringement, but they tend to be using... they're discussing copyright infringement, but they tend to use a lot of trademark principles in discussing copyright infringement. And what you're seeing when you're getting into some of these cases is that recognition that you've got these trademark principles underlying where there may not really be a trademark, but maybe copyright can apply somehow.
Well, in addition to, so turning back to the Nazi example, what exactly are the goods and services that were being sold under the brand name Nazi? It's Nazi brand blank. What goes in the blank? It's not the game. It's an Indiana Jones game.
Yeah, and that's unquestionably a trademark.
Yeah, so what is the Nazi trademark applied to? It's not really clear.
Yeah, it's applying, it seems to the name of this character.
But that brings us to our next topic. The character is a Nazi.
Yeah, and the character is not, and the thing is that when you talk about like character copyrights and the idea behind sort of protection in characters, the character is a Nazi, which is about as generic as you can get. That's like saying it's a soldier. It's just giving an affiliation with a particular, regime. Soldier. I mean, I could say they're a Roman legionnaire. It's exactly the same sort of statement.
This gets us to a second issue that's crucial to understand in trademarks called the spectrum of distinctiveness. And what this basically speaks to is that not every word is appropriate for use as a trademark for any particular good or service. Yep. Under American law, at least, we generally divide trademarks up into 4, sometimes 5 categories, ranging from generic to fanciful.
Yep.
Where generic trademarks are words that are the generic word for the thing that you're talking about. Yep. You can never have a trademark on a generic term. And the classic example is, I can't trademark the word apple as applied to an apple.
Yep.
Because then nobody else can say what an apple is.
Yeah, so I can't sell, Apple brand apples. It's just not allowed.
And by the converse flip side of that is what's called genericide, and that's where a trademark becomes a victim of its own success. The trademark becomes the generic word for the product to the point where you lose the trademark rights. And the classic example is elevator.
Yep. So elevator being one of them. Elevator used to be a trademark from it was the
Otis, wasn't it?
Otis elevator, and it was the moving room. Or vertical lift room, something like that. I can't remember what the generic term was for it.
Well, you ever wonder why sometimes words are different between the UK and here? I'm convinced that trademarks are part of it. Elevator was the brand name here, and so it's called an elevator. In the UK, they call them lifts.
Yep. And that's people talk about elevator being the common one. A few others, just so you guys know, escalator is also another one that's commonly known. And the one that's probably the most famous
Kerosene.
in trademark circles, in conjunction with it, is aspirin.
Aspirin, yeah. Bayer used to own aspirin.
And so, those are words that suffer genericide. Those are, people nowadays, I give these presentations on these things, and I tell people these used to be trademarks.
Styrofoam.
They're dumbfounded.
AstroTurf. There's a lot of, some of those might still be protected.
Yeah.
Thermos was a good one. Like, there's a lowercase t thermos and there's uppercase t thermos.
Yep. And stuff like that. So there's all sorts of sort of concerns where, words that become so associated with particular goods and services can actually become generic names for them because we need a generic name for it. Unfortunately, a lot of times it also applies to products that are kind of revolutionary because we don't have a generic name for it. And that's the things with it. And there are companies that have fought genericide.
Oh, yeah. For a long time, we used to say Xerox that for me.
Yep.
Nobody does. We say copy it for me.
And part of that, I don't remember, probably people probably don't remember this, but actually there used to be a series of ads that were great that Xerox put out. And I still use them as an example. And it was like two guys talking with each other. And it's clearly like the young intern and the big boss. Mm-hmm. And the big boss is yelling at the young intern. And the young intern's basically saying, what's wrong? You did what you told me to do. And the end stage of what you hear is you hear the intern say, you told me to get 10 Xeroxes. And then camera pans back and he's surrounded by 10 Xerox photocopiers. Mm-hmm. And that's the whole argument of saying when you say Xerox, you mean the photocopier, not the photocopy. Mm-hmm. And you mean a particular brand of photocopier is what it is. And it is. I think I remember people commenting, referring to, go Xerox this for me, stuff like that. Nobody says that anymore. They refer to them as photocopiers.
We have it now with Google. Go Google that. But what we mean when you say Google that, we don't mean go check Alta Vista.
We mean go check Google.
Yeah, so genericide is a real thing. I mean, Rollerblade had this problem, Kleenex had this problem, Band-Aid. A lot of these companies fought back to. Yep. The bottom line is, if that's not the generic word, then what is? Okay, well then facial tissue or inline skates.
Adhesive bandage.
Adhesive bandage. So you get these kind of weird words to describe things. So there are ways to fight back against that. So generic can never be trademarked. The next category is descriptive. These are words that are, like it suggests, descriptive of the characteristics of the product. So like sharp as applied to a knife. You probably can't get a trademark to Sharp brand knives because then if somebody else wants to say we have the sharpest knives, you're going to say you're infringing my trademark.
Yeah, and that's the thing with descriptive is a lot of times descriptive marks also tend to have some sort of geographical association, things like that. The one that I always pick on in conjunction with is banks, because the vast majority of banks are city or number bank, and that
First
usually
Federal
comes
Northwestern.
The idea of like First Bank of Iowa, First Bank of Missouri, probably is because they were the first bank in Iowa, they were the first bank in Missouri. Those are the kind of things that you sort of bump into. Those are descriptive marks. At the same time, if I say the first bank, everybody knows exactly what bank I'm referring to. So it's descriptive, but everybody knows and it's become a trademark.
The next category is suggestive. And to be clear, descriptive marks ordinarily cannot be used as a trademark. It is possible in some circumstances to acquire distinctiveness over time through exclusive use. And you can probably think of some pretty.
Yeah, again, I love to pick on First Bank. I mean, because First Bank basically probably used it because they were the first bank originally, but clearly everybody knows what bank I'm referring to.
How about Microsoft Windows? It's a window-based operating system, but clearly trademarked.
Yep.
Okay, the next category is suggestive, and suggestive marks are the lowest level of mark as far as distinctiveness that is always trademarkable.
Yep.
And suggestive marks they hint maybe at characteristics of the product without flat out describing it. And this is often a fine line between suggestive and descriptive.
There's also a lot of differences between different levels of suggestive marks too.
It's like sharp as applied to a TV, the sharpest picture, for example.
My favorite,
Blu-ray DVDs. It's a blue laser.
Yeah, my favorite actually thing for suggestive marks is actually Savage Arms applies to guns, which I think is an excellent example of a suggestive mark. I mean, you know what they're saying. Immediately as to what it is and suggestive. At the same time, it has no association. Yeah. It's clearly not descriptive, as to what it is. The individual, a knife or a gun is not in itself savage in any under definition of the word, but it gives you a bunch of associations that are very, very interesting, sort of in conjunction. And I like to use that one as a great example of a suggestive mark.
So the next category is arbitrary, and that's where you're using a real word, but it's being applied to a product that's got nothing to do with the word.
Yep.
An Apple computer is a classic example. Apples have nothing to do with computers.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. So it's choosing a word which is generic in other contexts, but is applied completely arbitrarily to what the goods and services are.
And then the best category as far as legal protectability is fanciful, and that's just a completely manufactured word, which obviously has no meaning other than what you give it. As the trademark user, Xerox is the classic example.
Yeah, Xerox is always used the classic example. A lot of times these, to be quite truthful, they're literally made up words. They're words that didn't exist before the person created it. Another great one is Google.
Google, yeah. Well, that's a mathematical term, but
but it has no association with a search engine.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so here's the problem with the Nazi trademark. In addition to not being clear what they're applying it to, they stuck it on a figurine of a Nazi. Kirk, isn't that just generic?
Yeah, it would seem to be. And again, what is the generic word for somebody who was a soldier fighting for
for the National Socialist Party?
The National Socialist Party.
They
were Nazi. It was the Nazi Party, sort of things. That's, you bump into, this seems to be generic. So why did they even put this TM on it? Isn't this exactly what you're not supposed to get a trademark on?
Yeah, and so I think our conclusion after looking at this is that setting aside that it appears to have been a clerical error at TSR in the first place, it's legally meaningless. There's no clear goods or services identified, and to the extent that there are, it's just a generic picture of a generic, Third Reich soldier. And so, to the extent that it's even interpreted as a claim of a trademark to that, it's legally ineffectual because
it's sort of like me saying, this is a Roman legionnaire.
TM.
This is TM. This is
Spartan phalanx. TM.
An American GI. TM.
Yep.
Sort of things. I think you get into the ideas that these seem to be the generic descriptions. Now again, could you move beyond it? Could you actually do something with it?
G.I. Joe.
Yeah, G.I. Joe. Definitely a possibility. I think G.I. Joe is a well-established trademark at this point in time.
Actually, along those lines, Transformers, descriptive or suggestive.
Yeah, and that's I think there's a lot of sort of fun words like that. The other one, just to sort of get into it, is recognizing that Nazi could be considered to be an arbitrary trademark if you said it was Nazi paper. It was printed on paper. At the same time, that's clearly not what they meant.
Yeah.
And at the same time, why would you actually ever use that as a trademark?
Your demographic for Nazi brand paper is probably
very limited, yes.
Wouldn't it be burning the paper in that situation?
You have to wonder.
All right. We have no mail today. We went through most of our mail last time, although I did hear from somebody anecdotally at our firm said that they were in a deposition and a videographer had mentioned that he listens to the podcast and loves the show. So, mystery videographer, if you're out there and listening to this, hi, and reach out sometime and say hello.
Send us questions, yep.
All right, well, there's the music. It is time to go. If you have questions, comments, or concerns, whether it's about Nazi trademarks or anything else, send us your thoughts on Twitter at LGGpod, email us at lggpodcast@gmail.com, or talk to us on our Facebook page, Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy. If you like what you hear, give us a review. We appreciate those reviews. It helps spread the word and helps other people find us. And you can find me on Twitter at Benjamin Siders, and you can find Kirk at KirkDMN. Next episode, Kirk, special guest, I believe.
We're hoping. Yeah,
I mean,
that's definitely the thing with it. The problem with the special guest is, we get to control our time. We can't necessarily make
she
sure
doesn't.
that she can.
So our special guest, we're going to not name names yet just in case this falls through, but if it's who we're hoping for, we have a brilliant and talented colleague who practices an IP advertising sweepstakes law, and she's a huge nerd to boot. So we thought we'd bring her on and talk about the law of RNG, basically,
yep.
and how you draw lines between...
And especially in today's day and age, the random number generator has become something incredibly important in a large number of games and a large number of geeky prototype properties as to whatever it is. And it's more important legally than you'd think.
Yeah. We're also looking at trying to bring in a Second Amendment specialist at some point to talk about the implications of phasers, energy weapons, and how that might apply in a Second Amendment context.
Yep.
Also, Kirk and I were talking a week or two ago. We are almost to the point where we're ready for the episode everybody wants, which is fan fiction and character copyrights.
We know you all want it.
Everybody keeps asking
about
for
it.
it.
Say, guess what it is.
So I think we'll probably do character copyrights probably need to come first.
Yeah, we'll probably do character copyright, and we obviously hinted about character copyright already in conjunction with these episodes.
That'll get into the Mickey Mouse stuff, which is also going to be coming up in a couple of years with the trademark or the copyright expiring on that.
But I think the key thing about it is, and as we've said in conjunction with it, this is a big topic. It's probably going to be a multi-episode topic for us to really cover it in any kind of depth. But we're basically there. We're thinking of what's that, how we're going to do it. It's taken
this long because we had to lay enough legal groundwork to be able to understand all the concepts that are involved. So, anyways, that's coming up. And on the Second Amendment, if you are or know a person who would like to be on the show and talk about that, let us know, because these people are harder to find than you might think.
Yeah, they're a little harder to find than you think.
All right, that's all for today. We'll see you next time. Lorem, play us out.
The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by Lewis Rice LLC, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer. This podcast was produced and recorded at Cool Fire Studios in St. Louis, Missouri.